From FingerLakes1.com and WGCC Geneva Community Radio, this is In Focus. Today we are asking a simple question. Why don't more people care about the environment? My guest today is Allie Berry. She's an environmental scientist working here in the Finger Lakes, and earlier this year, she launched a podcast. It's also a YouTube channel. It's called AquaDiary, and in it, she explores a whole host of different environmental issues with the goal of putting complex, science-y stuff in plain English. It's worked. Several of her recent episodes have racked up tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube, which is impressive given that attention spans are shorter than ever and environmental issues are complicated. A couple months ago, we started carrying Allie's podcast on FingerLakes1.com. She's not a journalist, at least not by trade, but she is doing work that I often associate most closely with what I consider to be real journalism. She tells stories, provides reputable sourced information, and delivers it without bias or the appearance of it. She cares deeply about the environment, but her work is educational. And despite it being educational, viewers and listeners never feel like they're in a lecture hall being told everything they thought before is wrong and they're bad for thinking it. So I wanted to talk to her. So without any further ado, here is my conversation with Allie Berry. All right, Allie, thanks so much for taking the time today. When someone asks you, what do? How do you answer that question?
Yeah, so I would normally say I'm an environmental project manager, but greater than that, I am an environmental scientist that specializes in water quality and watershed management, and that can look like a lot of different things in the professional world. I have been a watershed inspector on the ground type of field-based position, from also being a consultant, sampling groundwater that's been contaminated with some of the nastiest compounds mankind should have never heard of or invented. So it can mean a wide variety of things. On AquaDiary, I'm a science communicator and educator.
And when the layperson asks you what that real sciencey stuff actually looks like, what does your 9 to 5 look like?
Yeah, so right now it's looking at a lot of water quality data and trying to piece together a story of what's going on in water bodies from California to New York. I manage about 40 different lakes and reservoirs around the country, and sometimes those lakes and reservoirs can look really similar and sometimes they can look really different. So I'm primarily managing or looking to identify conditions that would cause a harmful algae bloom, which of course we know across the globe at this point is happening everywhere, sadly. So that's primarily what I'm up to is meeting with my clients, looking at water quality data, developing reports, and trying to piece together what's going on. But that can also look like getting your hands dirty in some of those field-based positions, walking through streams, sometimes covered in ice, or getting your nitrile gloves covered in BTEX compounds, trying to figure out what's in the groundwater.
What was it that when you think back to growing up or whenever the light bulb went off, you're like, I want to do something in environmental sciences. Do you remember what that moment was, or do you remember something like significant from your childhood when that interest was really sparked?
Yeah, so going back to childhood, I was born and raised in the Finger Lakes region. My mom and my dad actually were big on making sure that we got out to enjoy and understand the environment, whether that was catching bugs or fishing in some of our Great Lakes and Finger Lakes up here. And then when I decided to become an environmental scientist, around the time that I graduated from high school, we had our first confirmed harmful algal bloom in Owasco Lake. And also a few years before that, we weren't sure if hydrofracking was going to be coming to our region. So this is like roughly 2011. And I think between those two events, I realized that our lakes don't have a voice, right? AWLA, so the Owasco Watershed Lake Association, which I'm the president-elect for, one of our slogans is, being the voice of the lake. And I think I really wanted to do that and better understand why harmful algal blooms were happening and have some kind of educational foundation so that if hydrofracking did come to our region, I could be a part of that conversation and help ensure that if the industry did come here, we can have our best chances of keeping our water supply and our drinking water clean.
Did you think you'd become a podcaster at some point in the whole process?
No, not at
No?
all. Not at all. And maybe you planned on asking this, but part of the reason I did that was because throughout my career and throughout my life, personally and professionally, I've had so many people come to me with questions about, can I trust my tap water? Is bottled water better? Why are these algae blooms happening? It, Anything you could possibly imagine, really any water question has come my way at some point in time. And while I was happy to be that person in these people's lives to help answer that question or provide context to these things, it was also kind of sad that everyday people had to find somebody in their life that they felt was trustworthy and credible to be answering those questions. So I really wanted to make that kind of information more accessible because we all rely on water in the same kind of way. So no, I didn't see myself becoming a podcaster, but I can't say I'm entirely surprised because I, for some reason, have become the go-to person to field all these questions.
I want to talk about process because I think the way you produce the podcast, and obviously it's a YouTube channel and everybody should go check it out. But the way you produce episodes is like it feels level enough that the average person can enter without any significant background knowledge and understand what you're talking about. It also doesn't feel very much like a lecture. What does your process actually look like? And I'm assuming you're drawing on some of the things that, as you said, questions you've been answering over and over and over again. But a lot of the comments that I read on your YouTube channel also point to how much they enjoy the fact that you cite your sources and you're really open about that and the transparency piece. So what was the inspiration, and what does that process look like for you week to week in between obviously having a day job?
Yeah, it's a kind of a loaded question. So starting with the actual process and then going in after that and how I get the tone nailed down and everything. So it's a lot of research. I want to make sure it's credible, right? There's this gap between what scientists read, right? We read research papers on a daily basis, and those scientific papers are usually written for other scientists to understand. They're not written in the same way that a news article might be written, but they're full of content and context that I think the public deserves to hear as well. So
Yep.
drawing off of how I was taught to communicate as a scientific writer, and then, being a creative writer myself, which has always been a hobby of mine, I'm trying to combine really those two tones and making sure that I'm presenting some of the newest research, finding that, sourcing that, citing that correctly. I don't think a scientist can have the scientific writing style be out of them. If you're on my Patreon, there's in-text citations in APA format. That's all I know how to do. Um, but in terms of the tone, right, the point is to make it relatable, to make it understandable. A lot of this information is really important for the public to understand, but the tough reality is that in our world now, people have short attention spans. We're used to watching 30-second videos now and reels, which is okay, but it also means there has to be a lot of tone shifts. There has to be some element of entertainment and relatability. So I'll use a lot of analogies and try to make kind of jokes in this informed, irreverent tone, because sometimes the things that we find here feel a little bit silly, right? Like, oh, how could we make that mistake again, right? So it's kind of poking fun at it sometimes to, keep it relatable, to keep it human, and less drone-like, which I think, unfortunately, some science communication can be. But again, I don't really blame our fellow scientists for that. We were taught to communicate to other scientists and taught to be in academia. So bridging that gap can be a tough one. I've always tried to nail that correctly, so it feels really rewarding to see those comments and to hear that I am hitting that right.
What was the learning curve like as you started to develop that voice and figure out what format works, what doesn't? I mean, you're only, what, 10, 15 episodes deep? You've only been doing this a handful of months. You've gotten a ton of traction. And that's usually hard to do in algorithmic media. What has that whole process been like?
Yeah, I honestly am a little surprised, a little shocked, a little amazed by the the response that I've gotten. I I think the learning curve has really come before the podcast, right? As a watershed inspector, I was communicating with people, all kinds of people, other professionals, the average homeowner, contractors that you meet out in the field, people from varying backgrounds and degrees. Water is very interdisciplinary. So I think when you are starting off in a field-based position where you are face-to-face with these different kinds of people, the state government agencies, down to the average homeowner, you start to understand how to communicate to the person that you're speaking to in the way that they understand. And I think when you have a passion for that subject, it doesn't really become like a hurdle to get over. It's something that feels natural and motivating to try to achieve. So when I first created the podcast, I had listened to a podcast about podcasts, as one would do. And they had stated that there are 3 things that you really need to hit here to reach people. You have to have background in the subject, which I knew I had. You have to have a passion about the subject, which I knew I had, but there also has to be people looking for that content. And that was the thing that I wasn't sure if I would be able to achieve. And so I think I really, really focused on how I was communicating these things and, the tone that I had and the comparisons that I try to draw. I want everybody and anybody to be able to derive value off of my podcast episodes, whether you're a scientist or an average homeowner concerned about, honestly, the same things a lot of scientists are concerned about. So the process, fortunately, I think came before the podcast, and I think I just lucked out with the tone that I originally went for.
What is in your estimation, is it kind of a communication gap that's existed? Because obviously one of the through lines here at Finger Lakes One is we have seen environmental issues take center stage, dominate the headlines for years now. Whether it's HABs or whether it was an incinerator 10 years ago or landfills or all these different things. But getting people to latch on to sort of the minutia, the details, the nuance and the complexity of all of the inner workings of how this stuff happens or how these issues play out is like almost a puzzle that no one's been able to piece together yet. And it does seem like you are, if you haven't accomplished it, you have come the closest to accomplishing it here in the region. But you're not doing journalism like in the traditional sense of journalism, but I think one of the first times you and I exchanged some emails, like I view what you're doing as the closest thing to environmental journalism as exists in 2026. So to you, does it feel like a communication gap that exists, or is it just that no one has literally thought to talk about these things and explain these things in a way that the layperson who is just gotten off of work, or they're kind of tired, or they're looking for something to tune into for 30 or 40 minutes. No one's ever tried it before in the format that you have?
I wouldn't like to think that I'm the first person to try. I sure hope that isn't true. But thank you so much also for the compliments. That means a lot. Yeah, I think some of it, that my inspiration behind starting it was because I saw a communication and an education gap, right? And it's nobody's really fault. Like, journalists do their best to gather as much information as possible on these environmental issues that they're reporting on. But they don't always have the background to know how to investigate what the science says, to go find those scientific journals, to kind of corroborate what they're being told by a state agency, right? The story kind of stops with the interview from the state agency. And again, not their fault, but also on the other side, again, scientists are just reading scientific papers and then writing and communicating to other scientists the majority of the time. I think in science, we get so familiar with the jargon that we've learned, like in our classrooms or in our field, that it becomes second nature to us to use complicated, or at least what would be complicated to the ordinary person, vocabulary. And I think it kind of gets lost how we communicate what we mean by that. So I think that's the communication side of it, but there's also like an education side of it. None of us are ever really required to take an environmental science course or a water resources course or the like in our entire lives. Unless you seek that stuff out, you're not going to find it. And that's a huge disservice, I think, to our communities and the public, because we all rely on those systems so much. So I think it's a bit of a communication gap between two very different types of backgrounds and people doing the communication, and then also an education gap. Like, the public doesn't know what they don't know. I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson in an interview once said, the questions that I fear are the questions that we don't yet know to ask. And I'd like to bring that type of thinking back into the public sphere, because again, we all rely on the same stuff, right?
Yeah. Okay. So another process question that I'm really curious about. How do you figure out how to narrow the scope enough so that it doesn't spider web out and the episode is all of a sudden covering way more than what you initially intended? Do you start with a question and try to stay within like the narrow field of that question?
Yes, mostly. I think I made the mistake of not doing that in one of my very first episodes, which were audio only to start, until folks on YouTube were like, we'd like to see you speaking, and I was like, fair enough. One of the first ones I had done was about Owasco and my background and understanding of some of the dynamics at play in Owasco from a political perspective, a stakeholder management perspective, meaning all the people involved and taking interest in how the lake is doing, people relying on it, which is quite literally everybody when you have so many towns around these massive Finger Lakes, right? And I kind of got into comparing all the different Finger Lakes because it was another question that I was asked. So that episode ended up being like an hour long. So it is definitely a thing, right? You have to narrow down the question that you're trying to answer. And in some of these topics, I'm discovering things myself as I'm researching them and writing them. So it's a good learning opportunity for me as well to come across some of this new research to communicate. But in some of those topics that I feel I know a lot about, it is very hard to restrict yourself to just answering that one question. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because it can become a series, right? I think the public, when they're hearing these episodes, they often ask follow-up questions in my comment section, which is just another opportunity to break that topic down further across more episodes, which again, I think is a good thing, not only because of the follow-up and the engagement and the conversations that starts, but it also allows you to get deeper into that spider web, right? So I also like to say I'll never run out of topics on AquaDiary because there are so many to get into, right? And these interrelated ones, because everything just seems to be interconnected and interrelated when it comes to water. There's few things it doesn't touch. So it is very hard. How I do that is I try to answer the questions I've been most commonly asked, and then I'll look at my comments as guidance for follow-up episodes, or if there was something I really wanted to talk about that I felt like I didn't get to because it pushed the script too long, then I'll do a follow-up episode on it.
When you sit down from writing down or pulling together those questions until you are uploading to YouTube, pull back the curtain for us. How much time goes into like one normal episode?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I don't know that I've actually counted because some weeks I am really just cramming and doing whatever it takes to get it out on time by Friday mornings at 8 a.m. The video editing process I think takes the longest, which I think can sometimes be anywhere from like 4 to 6 hours. Because I'm not only editing video and audio, but I'm also trying to pull in visual aids or examples,
Yeah.
or sometimes other videos of like news coverage of a certain topic. So I think between those three aspects, it's the video editing that takes the longest. Writing and research probably also takes about that long. I'm usually working on writing 2 or 3 different episodes at a time just to try to keep pace with it. So I'm constantly writing and doing research. I've paid for a few scientific journals at this point just to make sure that I'm getting kind of like a wide array, right? And then you run into the situation where some scientific journals have better coverage of certain topics than others. And when I'm bouncing all over the place from, bottled water to the Finger Lakes to microplastics and PFAS, like, some journals have better coverage of those topics than others. So the research, I would say, and the video editing takes the longest. Once the video or the script is written, I can sit down and record it for maybe about 5 or 10 minutes longer than the episode actually is because everybody misspeaks. Had some people say,
Right.
how do you just communicate perfectly? No, this video is chopped into 100 pieces. You just don't know that. So yeah, the whole process would probably be about 2 full work days on a good day.
What is so I want to get into feedback here in a little bit, specifically on some of the episodes. But as far as putting yourself out there in this way, obviously you said off the top that it wasn't something that you thought you'd be doing. It wasn't a project you thought you'd be working on. When you think about, or when you were thinking about putting yourself out there like this, did you have any concerns? Were you, did you have any apprehension, or were you just like, no, you know what? I feel really passionately about this. I'm just going to do it. And whatever happens, happens.
Yeah, You know how one of the pieces of advice in public speaking is to like imagine everybody in their underwear? Well, the good thing about video podcasting is you're by yourself, right? So I like to, I'm a pretty introverted person. So I like to just kind of imagine nobody there, right? I'm in this room, I shoot in this room by myself. So it's easy to, I think, mentally disconnect from the fact that over 500,000 people saw one of my episodes a couple of weeks ago. So I feel pretty disconnected on, the social way, but it isn't something I really put a lot of thought into because I feel that passionate about making sure this type of information gets out to the public and that people can use it to make good choices in their lives and stay safe, stay informed, and advocate for the things that need to change. I felt like that mattered way more than my potential discomfort.
You mentioned that comments help shape your episodes quite often. Not everybody in this space reads the comments. Some of us choose to say no thank you to all that chaos, but you do. What's been the most surprising piece of feedback that you've gotten so far?
Surprising. I would say the amount of support. I offer YouTube memberships, for example, early release, but with me working full time, I can really only get an episode out like a day in advance, and sometimes it's at like 8 p.m. So those members really aren't getting a massive benefit on my YouTube channel.
Yeah.
But the number of members that I have gained on my YouTube over a short amount of time, or the amount of people that have pledged subscriptions to my Substack, the amount of support, just supporting the work. As you know, FOIA filings can be like $300 something. Yes,
Yeah.
I'm working full time, but I'm not rich either. So I think the most amazing thing of those comments is the amount of support and some of the kind words that people will say of appreciating the work and appreciating that it's being put out there, or like you had already mentioned as well, that there is some aspect of entertainment that they actually enjoy listening to it and that they're not bored. It is a balance I've been trying to strike, and it feels really rewarding to know that I am putting rigorous information out there in a way that is not only informative but also entertaining for people to listen to.
Speaking of rewarding or a feather in your cap, so to speak, one of your recent episodes, you actually went into a Rochester lab and you kind of got a behind the scenes look at how water is processed and treated in the city. What was that like? How did that feel? Having only been maybe a dozen or so episodes into this whole thing.
It was pretty surreal. If you'd watched the episode, then you've heard that I was at a conference. Actually, like for my full-time job, I was at a conference up in Lake George, and I had turned around to leave the dinner table at that dinner that night, and there was two men standing behind me, and I could see on there, and I had just come out with my first City of Rochester drinking water episode, literally I think a couple of days before this conference. And I had seen that they had their tags on for the City of Rochester, and I was like, but I didn't think like I had only had maybe like 10 to 12 episodes out at the time. I'm like, there's no way. Like, don't be full of yourself. They don't know who you are, right? Is what I'm thinking to myself. And I thought maybe they were coming to the table and I was just in their way and they were coming to talk to somebody else at my table. They put their hands out there and they were like, we're from the City of Rochester. We recognized you from the podcast and we wanted to introduce ourselves. And my initial reaction was like, oh no, because, I try to cover the good and bad, right? There are some things that have happened to the City of Rochester that, damaged their reputation temporarily. And I imagine that they would be very upset that I had reported on that, right? But they felt that the coverage was fair. And that is when they invited me to come into the plant. So actually getting that invite, again, incredibly rewarding to have that kind of recognition from municipal water bureau that is supplying drinking water to literally hundreds of thousands of people. Because in a lot of ways, I feel like a nobody. I'm just like a local from Upper New York, just your average scientist, and there's quite a few in the region, right? So for them to recognize me, to have appreciated the work that I did, and then invite that and offer that level of transparency was incredible of them to do. And if you watch that'll be a 3-part series, by the way, hopefully coming out with the second part of that series this week. And they reviewed it and everything. They were very involved, but it's amazing to see how transparent they are, right? And if you've been watching my episodes for a while, I am a big proponent of drinking your tap water and learning about your tap water rather than relying on bottled water for probably 100 reasons at this point. So it was really nice to be able to offer people that scope and that view of what that actually looks like, because I think we're really disconnected. And one of the things that they had mentioned in that initial interview that is out now and you can watch is that the news coverage of water bureaus and water suppliers and water purveyors is always negative, right? They're not thanked for the problems that aren't existing 99% of the time. They're just criticized for that one main break, or if there's one problem, a lot of the work that they do is invisible. And that is a symptom of the system working, but it is also a huge disjustice or injustice to the work that they do. So I was really happy to get the invite and be able to offer that to people. And huge thank you to the city of Rochester for their transparency and for their equivalent passion to water quality.
Out in central New York, obviously Micron is the biggest non-environmental story, but even you've found some ways to connect the environmental issues that will likely be coming down the road. From your vantage point, what are the biggest questions, or what is the biggest question that you're seeing related to Micron come your way?
The biggest questions that are coming my way are related to their discharge, and a lot of those decisions are still being made. And there are some regulatory gaps there with PFAS. We regulate what's called the long chain forms of PFAS, and there are a lot of shorter chains that are chains that are suspected to be in the discharge. So I think one of the greatest questions is how is that actually going to be managed? I believe they are going to have their own wastewater treatment, but it is also being connected to municipal treatment as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. The biggest question that I have is what will the population impacts actually be on the city of Syracuse? The city of Syracuse has the benefit of having kind of a redundant system and where they draw their water depending on where you are in the city. But there are concerns that were brought to me directly by the Skaneateles Lake Association on what that population will do in terms of stress on the water supply coming from Skaneateles, right? Like we know that the water in that area is going to drain to Ontario. We know that Micron is going to be drawing from Ontario, but in terms of how many people is that going to bring to the central New York area? How many of those people are going to be living in the city center where they're getting their drinking water from Skaneateles, and how will that impact our Finger Lakes here? So it's kind of like it's related, but like in an adjacent kind of way, right? To impacts that Micron may bring. So that's what I'm keeping my eye on the most, because I do trust our regulators. I know that the New York State DEC is kind of going above and beyond what's required of Micron. And I know Micron's been compliant, at least to date, with what's being required. Can our regulations be updated to manage those short chain PFAS compounds? Oh, absolutely. But that's kind of the thing, right? Research on health sometimes comes out before the federal government pushes certain regulations. And it doesn't make a ton of sense to regulate something that we barely understand. It is called an emerging contaminant for a reason. We don't 100% know everything about it. We do know quite a bit, but it's kind of a subject of ongoing debate, right? It's like a chicken before an egg kind of thing. Should we regulate something before we know much about it, or should we wait to regulate something until we do know something about it? So I try to stay tangentially related to that topic of discussion, because it'll depend on what research comes out and how motivated regulators are to change some of those things. And it's not really New York State's fault, and it's not Micron's fault, right? You need PFAS in semiconductor manufacturing. That's just how it is. So in terms of things we can control, can manage right now, that's in terms of water infrastructure. So that's what I'll be keeping an eye on.
Let's talk microplastics. Answer the question everybody wants to know. Are we all just a collection of microplastics? Are we just two collections of microplastics talking to each other right now?
Pretty much, unfortunately, yes. I don't think there's been a single organism on this planet tested that hasn't had some amount of microplastics in it. With that being said, there has been recent criticism about how we're testing for microplastics. If you can imagine a person in a lab, they're wearing what? Plastic gloves, right? So there's questions if the gloves or the materials that scientists are wearing, even down to their lab coats, are shedding microplastics into the things that they're sampling. I used to sample for PFAS when I was a consultant. You couldn't use Sharpies, you couldn't wear a raincoat. There were so many things that you couldn't do. You couldn't wear makeup or sunscreen because PFAS is in everything, right? It's the same kind of thing with sampling and testing for microplastics, you'd kind of want to reduce any cross-contamination into the sample, which is like kind of impossible because plastics are in everything. So there's that. And then there's also, we don't fully know how microplastics are affecting our health. So are they everywhere inside of us? Yes, unfortunately, but we don't have enough information to know what they're doing and if the existing research out there is actually representative of what we were sampling based on some of the sampling critiques.
I'm sure you've been asked this question. Can we put the genie back in the bottle? Would there be a way? And obviously it would probably take years and years and decades and decades and decades. And maybe, our great, great, great grandchildren would be the ones who'd actually see it. But could we undo that? Or is it kind of just, it's there?
I think it's too late. I don't think my opinion is the only opinion. I'm sure somebody else might say something different, but so you don't just have microplastics, we have like nanoplastics, right? Which are like getting inside of our DNA. On my video microplastics, I try to provide an image to give you a sense of scale. But they are tinier than you could possibly imagine. I can't imagine a reality where you can somehow remove that from every living being on Earth and the oceans and our drinking water supplies and our food systems. It's too massive of a problem. I think we'll be stuck with it for a very long time.
Fascinating. Okay, so let's talk about what I think was probably the most viral thing you've done so far, that reflecting pool. Before we get into like the specifics of it, how did that idea get in front of you? Was it just sort of responding to seeing the stuff online? That was obviously, there was plenty of headlines, lots of chatter on social media. Was it questions you were getting, or both? How'd you land on that? And take me through it. Like, where did you begin? And did you expect, north of 500,000 people to watch that video in the first, couple weeks?
No, I did not. So I primarily went to school to learn how to manage algae blooms because there's still a lot that we don't understand about algae blooms when it comes to lakes, right? There's a lot of dynamics at play. It's really complicated. They've been around for over 4 billion years. So that's why I studied water in the first place, was to understand algae blooms. And so when those articles were coming out about the reflecting pool and about algae, and I had already, an existing podcast that's talked about algae management before and lake management before and all these other water issues, I was like, how can I not do an episode on this? Also because as like an environmental project manager, like my company primarily helps, municipal drinking water reservoirs, wastewater reservoirs, industrial, those 40 lakes and reservoirs that I manage. Primarily what I'm doing is helping them understand the algae bloom dynamics and their exact situation and how we can best address that. So it's not only part of the reason I went to school in the first place, but it's also what I've been working in. And so when you have a big algae when you have a big algae event like that, that reaches the amount of publicity that I did for that story, I was like, how can I not do an episode on it? Because I was watching the story unfold, and again, having like managed algae myself, and I've been looking into it for over 10 years at this point. There were a lot of decisions that were made that could have been better decisions, and I wanted to kind of give that picture, right? Because there was, it was really politicized. Of course it is, right? We're talking about the current administration's decisions. But I really wanted to touch on like the science of it and how these issues are actually managed, and then compare that to the reality. Try to depoliticize it a little bit as much as is possible. Just because I think water, for some reason, gets politicized. A lot of the environment gets politicized, which I very much dislike. Because again, we all rely on these things equally.
How did you manage to do that? Because I did think that was one of the really interesting components of the whole video, was just that. Like, you did manage pretty darn well to depoliticize it, and politics is in everything. How was it? Was it more work than a normal episode? Was it something that you just you tried to keep it grounded in a certain number of things, or what was that?
I try to keep all of my science content objective and neutral. It's a sign of a good scientist. A lot of scientific writing and in academia has to remain neutral and fair and fact based. So I think I was very experienced in that, and also as a watershed inspector, meeting with multiple different stakeholders with different interests, different political backgrounds, you learn how to speak in a neutral and objective way. So I was very familiar with that kind of communication. I think what made it a little bit easier is going back into the history of the reflecting pool. If that pool has had algae issues for 100 years, I think it was a week or two after it had originally opened after Henry Bacon designed it that it had an algae bloom. So I think that helps depoliticize it a little bit. Like, yes, decisions were made by this administration that could be questioned. However, with that being said, it's been a long-running issue under multiple administrations, and I think some of the recent news articles were missing that because it's kind of like clickbait, right? When you're, attacking one administration over another, you're going to get a good proportion of people that are clicking on it just because they're angry about this president. It works really well. It's tried, true, and tested.
Yep.
And so I think maybe I accidentally took advantage of that a little bit of that news cycle, right? And had released it at the right time to get that kind of response. But I think people were a bit surprised to find that I wasn't just there to add to the political jargon. I was there to add to the scientific context.
Let's talk a little bit about wildfire smoke. In the last 2-3 weeks, that has been in the news here in the Northeast, especially in upstate New York. There were a couple days that were worse than most other days. You have to go back, I think, 2 or 3 years before the last big wildfire smoke incident, I guess, or phase of time that we had, period. What is one thing that people should keep in mind when they're hearing about wildfire smoke around them or in their community?
I think one thing to keep in mind is a lot of it comes down to blame. It's very easy for us on the East Coast to point our fingers at Canada and say that they're not managing their fires well. I'm sure there are decisions, just like in the US, if there are history of fire suppression. I can't really comment on how exactly Canada manages it, but it would be far-fetched to say they're perfect. You can hardly say anyone's perfect at anything. So I think part of it is the blame, right, with climate change being part of the reason why these wildfires are getting worse. And we are in the United States one of the biggest contributors to climate change. So pointing our fingers at Canada when in a way you could kind of say we're partially responsible for that is it's not really a fair situation. I hope that our country continues to give support to Canada in the ways that Canada has given support to us during some of our worst fires. We are neighbors. We're battling a lot of the same issues. So again, coming back to the idea of neutrality, this is an issue that we're battling all over the North American continent at this point. So I think it's important to be fair and, do your research on why these fires are happening. The big plume that we had here in 2023, I think it was 97% of those fires that were started that year in Canada was due to lightning, right? So yes, this is a natural system and it's happening for a natural reason, but you have to look at the underlying context of how we've historically managed these fires and all of the contributing factors that are adding up to it and how we can look at ourselves and live more sustainably.
Okay, so for the rest of the show, I want to just hit you with some HABs questions. You've mentioned HABs a couple of times, but I kind of feel like, and maybe you do too, I don't want to age you here, but I kind of feel like I'm 36 years old. I feel like I've grown up with HABs. Like HABs have become, at least in the last decade and a half, more of a commonly known thing. And watching it become more and more something that more and more lay people understand, or at least understand the bare bones of, has been kind of interesting. What's the biggest misconception out there about HABs?
That it's always farmers' fault. That is not always the case. And we all have an impact on everything that we do in a watershed. So if you're unfamiliar, a watershed is a land area that drains into a lake, which is based on the hills or otherwise consider the topography, right? We have this drainage basin. You can think about it like a bathtub. And then pointing our fingers at one stakeholder group like farmers and blaming them absolves us of our guilt on what we do on our land. A lot of us have lakeside properties. Are we raking leaves directly into the lake this fall? Please don't. right? Like there's little things like
Yeah.
this. Are we applying lawn fertilizer 2 inches from the shoreline? Are we thinking about that? Are we maintaining our septic systems? It prevents real progress from being made when you isolate a group like that. I'm not
Yeah.
saying that farmers don't have an impact. Again, we all do. But pointing at any one group more than another is not always fair, is not always data driven, it's not always based in truth. And if you want something to work, you need everybody to work together. If we're trying to improve the health of our lakes, you need everybody's input and everybody's participation. If you're going to single out a group like that, they're not going to want to work with you, and that's not helping anybody.
Vegetation management, or more recently, I guess, vegetation elimination around lakes. How much of a factor is that weighed against all the other things?
I would have to look at the actual research to be able to draw actual numbers from that. But based on what I was taught as a watershed scientist back in college, removing vegetation around the shoreline, it limits shade, right? So cyanobacteria want what? Sunlight and nutrients and warm water to grow. So you're providing more sunlight for the cyanobacteria. Again, they're a bacteria, actually not an algae, even though we call them harmful algal blooms. You're giving them more sun, for one. You're also, when it rains, vegetation, when it runs off the landscape and it hits other plants, it helps slow down the water. And slow moving water can drop out sediment and nutrients. So if you've got fast moving water, you've probably seen, footage of floods or fast moving rivers. They can move boulders sometimes if they're fast moving. If it's moving slower, it's able to, drop all of that stuff out. Nutrients that algae use or cyanobacteria use attach to sediment particles. So if you're removing that buffer around a water body, you're allowing all of those nutrients and all of that sediment to just rush into the lake. So I would say those are some of the two biggest impacts.
HABs in the Finger Lakes, are we a hot spot, or is this just a part of the state where, because we have more lakes, it's more observable and there's more actionable data to work with?
It's a problem all over the country. Even for lakes that don't have a lot of nutrients. You can look at Skinny Atlas, for example. It has very, very low nutrients. It's confused scientists for a long time on why we're getting blooms in a lake like that has lower nutrients than you'd expect to fuel cyanobacteria blooms. So it's happening all over the country. We are not unique to this situation whatsoever. I think, yes, we're just surrounded by water resources here. So we see it more often. We're impacted more directly, more frequently. Almost all of our drinking water supplies, right, is coming from a Finger Lake if you're in a major city in upstate New York. So it's a risk. It's a risk to that drinking water supply when they produce toxins. So I think, yeah, we're just seeing a lot of it because we're surrounded by it all the time.
And what you see in the Finger Lakes or across upstate New York, are most municipalities and their water treatment systems well equipped to deal with the amount of HABs that water sources are seeing around the region?
Typically, yes. A majority of the cities in upstate New York will have some type of carbon treatment, which is usually what's recommended for municipal water supplies to help treat any toxins that may show up. With that being said, there is a limit, right? If you had, and I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, I would have to go look at the research. But you can have a very toxic bloom that the carbon can't catch at all. That has happened. Not in upstate New York, but around the world and around the country, that has happened before. You also need to replace that carbon, and so when you have toxic algae blooms happening frequently, you have to replace that more often, and that media is very expensive. Skinny Atlas does not have this protection though because they're an unfiltered water supply. So if there was a toxic algae bloom that entered the pipe, right, for the city of Syracuse, they would be at risk.
Yeah. What's something, and I'm sure you get this question fairly often, what's the easiest way the average person can contribute positively to the HAB situation in upstate New York anywhere?
Yeah, I would say maintain your septic system if you have one. Make sure you're getting that inspected annually or at least every 2 years because I know it can be expensive. Don't throw your lawn clippings or your leaves directly into the water. Try to leave some sort of a buffer if you have a shoreline property. Pick up your pet waste if you're going to a park. And if you're visiting a shoreline or lake-based park, pick up your waste. And also learn what they look like. There is a HABs reporting tool through the New York State DEC that you can find online. And if you learn how to identify an algae bloom, you're not only, keeping yourself safe and your dog safe. Some algae blooms do produce toxins that can kill a dog within minutes to hours. So it is really important to make sure you're looking at the water before they go in, or before your family goes in as well. There's a lot of photos online of the difference between a harmful algae bloom and a non-harmful.
If someone's listening to this right now and they're curious, they're interested not just in the podcast but in the environmental science stuff, and they're thinking to themselves, "Boy, I want to read more. I want to learn more." If it's not HABs, what to you is the next most pressing environmental issue for upstate that folks could learn more about in their free time?
I would say general water quality. So apart from HABs, right? There are some countries or regions of the world that have a water quantity problem, and then others that have a water quality problem. And then places of the world that have both. We obviously have a lot of water. We don't have to worry about conserving water as much as you might if you lived in California or Nevada, right? But water quality issues in general, because, harmful algae blooms isn't the only reason we should be concerned about maintaining the health of our lakes. It's also disinfection byproducts in our drinking water. So that is a secondary probable carcinogen that can be produced in the drinking water treatment process when organic matter like algae, but even sticks and leaves and whatnot mix with chlorine, and it can create these byproducts. So I really like to look at things in terms of like safety and in terms of looking 7 generations ahead. So even if you're not concerned about algae blooms, we need to be concerned about making sure that these water resources are still around 7 generations from now and not just us. It drives me nuts when people say, well, this isn't going to affect me. Okay, well, what about your kids or your kids' kids or your kids' kids, right? Like this is how we should be looking at our water resources. So I would say overall water quality management as the major pressing issue, of course, with HABs or harmful algal blooms being the symptom of that, but then also emerging contaminants. So that could be things like PFAS and like microplastics. Keeping an eye out on the research. If you are familiar with reading scientific papers, at least looking at the abstract. Or I don't like the use of AI, but if you have to put it in AI to understand what some of it means, or ask somebody or a friend or a family member that's in science, keep an eye on these emerging contaminants. There are tons of historical stories and context for what happened to communities that found out that they were exposed to some emerging contaminant and how it affected them and their families for the rest of their lives. So I think it's important to pay attention and stay attuned to what we're learning about these contaminants to make sure that you're making decisions that can keep you and your family safe.
7 generations ahead. Are we doing a good job? Are we on track, or are we off the rails?
I think we're off the rails. Yeah, it's a concept that comes from a lot of indigenous communities. Actually, the Haudenosaunee is where I learned it from when I was at SUNY ESF. They would come and speak and give the Thanksgiving address, and that was one of the concepts that I learned from them. Is thinking 7 generations ahead.
All right, last question for you. Obviously, this show is all about community and keeping our communities intact. The environment is as essential as it gets to community, especially here in the Finger Lakes in central New York. I'm curious, what has it been like building a community online around environmental education?
Yeah, I think at first when I was a bit smaller, it felt like I had created like a new friend group of people that were all interested and concerned about water quality issues, which was really cool. Felt like the center of a friend group, which was also a little strange, being really at the center of anything. Now that it's grown to over 10,000 subscribers in like less than 90 days, I'm shocked. I don't even think I can mentally imagine what 10,000 people look like, right? So it's again, I think rewarding. I feel very humbled by it, really, knowing how many people have been looking for this information. And it's a little saddening in a way to, have to be the person that accumulates that many subscribers because there's that much of a thirst for that knowledge. I guess pun intended, right? But yeah, it's strange. It's strange and rewarding and humbling and a little sad, like all at the same time, I'd say.
Allie Berry, thank you so much for the time today. We will link to everything that we talked about today, as well as the YouTube channel in the show notes.
Thank you very much, Josh, for having me. It was a pleasure, and thank you for the work that you do for the community as well.